to yet another extremely topical and extremely timely AMET webinar. As many of you know, AMET is a premier think tank and policy shop in Washington, D.C. We are extremely proud of our wonderful webinars that bring the brightest and the best intellects, analysts, and scholars into your home every week, such as today's guest, the brilliant writer and extremely talented scholar, Jonathan Tobin. But we are more than just a think tank. Every week, we are on Capitol Hill, where we meet with scores of members of Congress and their foreign policy staffers, or mostly their foreign policy staffers, who've come to trust us, to rely on us, and to depend on us for up-to-date, reliable, and accurate information about everything regarding Israel and the Middle East, and most particularly about the details leaking out of Vienna about the highly pernicious Iranian nuclear deal. AMET gets absolutely no funding from any government and depends entirely on viewers such as you. Please consider making a meaningful contribution at ametonline.org, or please consider sponsoring a webinar, which you can find in your invitation. AMET is extremely excited to partner with Jonathan Tobin and JNS.org. JNS is an incredibly valuable online publication that brings a much-needed perspective into the homes of scores of thousands of people around the globe on a daily basis. I've come to rely on the excellency of writers of JNS for up-to-date news and the careful, cogent, and brilliant analyses from their editorial staff, and particularly from Jonathan Tobin. I would like all of you to kindly consider making a donation to this wonderful news organization, jns.org. In order to do that, please go to www.jns.org/sponsor-JNS. At the helm of JNS.org is one of America's leading Jewish intellectuals, Jonathan Tobin. Jonathan is an international, he is the editor of JNS.org. He's a senior contributor for the Federalist and a columnist for Newsweek, the New York Post, Haaretz and Israel Hayom, as well as a regular contributor for other publications such as the Washington Examiner and Commentary Magazine. In fact, he used to be an editor of Commentary Magazine. He covers the American political scene, foreign policy, the U.S. Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, and the Jewish world. Okay, he's besides being an editor and chief political blogger for Commentary, Jonathan also served as editor-in-chief of the Jewish Exponent in Philadelphia and editor of the Connecticut Jewish Ledger. Jonathan has won more than 50 awards, including top columnist for Jewish publications 10 times. Most recently, if I'm not mistaken, in 2018 and 2019. He appears regularly on television, commentating on politics in the United States and Israel, foreign policy, and Jewish affairs, and lectures on college campuses and to Jewish communities. He was born in New York City and educated at Columbia University, where I went to school as well. There's long been a misperception by many across the world that American support for the state of Israel has been the result of a secret Jewish cabal of, quote, Jewish power and political influence, Jewish wealth, and Jewish control of the media. As Walter Russell Mead writes in his brilliant book, Ark of the Covenant, as well as in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, the facts here are not borne out and are simply anti-Semitic stereotypes. In fact, before the establishment of the State of Israel, early Reform Jewish leaders such as Rabbi Emil Hertz rejected the State of Israel. However, by the end or the mid-1940s, when news of the Holocaust was clearly out, there had been near anonymity or unanimity, by most American Jews and their almost unwavering support of the state of Israel. But then the Jews in this country were mostly a little green and new to this country. Many spoke with accents and felt intimidated within the corridors of power. Today, many of us occupy the corridors of power and are represented in the highest echelons of the government. Yet we are watching a slow and steady erosion of support for the state of Israel. And this is occurring at an extremely dangerous moment in Jewish history. Within my lifetime, I've been privileged to witness tremendous displays of unity in times of existential crises, such as during the 1967 and 73 wars, and even while the 2015 JCPOA was being drafted, when we were able to get thousands of concerned American citizens, both Jewish and non-Jewish, on the streets of New York and on the Capitol in Washington. But at this very moment, when the possibility of a much more pernicious Iranian nuclear deal is on the table, with the Iranians having had galloped towards huge advancements in enrichment, delivery capability, and weaponization, it seems like many American Jews are asleep at the wheel of history. What is most concerning is the decline of support among our nation's millennials. According to a recent poll taken by the American Jewish Committee, published on April 25th, 2022, of Jewish and Israeli millennials, among American Jewish millennials, with a sample size of 800 Jewish Americans and 1,000 Israeli millennials, among American Jewish millennials, almost half, fully 46.5%, felt that a strong relationship between the American Jewish community and the state of Israel was either not too important or not at all important. While fully 80% of Israeli millennials felt that a strong state of Israel is necessary for the survival of the Jewish community outside of the state of Israel. This is among many very interesting points of divergence between young millennials in both Israel and the United States, and I encourage everyone to read the survey. Jonathan, first of all, what do you feel are the reasons behind the divergence of opinions between young American Jews and young Israeli Jews?
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you and to all of our viewers on behalf of Emet and the important work it does in raising awareness about what is going on and the imperative to speak up on behalf of Israel, Jewish rights, and the U.S. Israel alliance. And to be given the opportunity to sort of place in his historic context this important question of the divergence between these two different Jewish tribes. For many decades, the slogan for the United Jewish Appeal was, "We are one." That phrase represented the assumption that American Jewish identification with the struggle to create, build, and defend the state of Israel was not merely strong, but a product of a consensus that was not up for debate. And for the generation that grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust and lived through the traumatic weeks prior to the Six-Day War, when the Jewish state survival was in doubt, as well as the trauma of the Yom Kippur War, that was largely the case. Since then, pride in Israel's achievements has seemingly waned. Bitter criticisms of the Jewish state are now more likely to be heard in the synagogues and community centers that once resounded with support for the Jewish state and pledges during times of crisis than praise. A belief that Israel is mistreating the Palestinians and has erected obstacles to peace has become an article of faith among many, if not the majority, of American Jews who identify as liberals and Democrats. Also undermining the notion of solidarity is the resentment of the non-Orthodox denominations about the lack of religious pluralism in Israel. Increasingly, American Jews look at Israel with the same sort of lack of comprehension and disdain with which urban liberals regard red state Americans. This frame of reference was reinforced by the fact that former President Obama, who retained the loyal support of most Jewish voters, was highly unpopular in Israel while former President Donald Trump, who is despised by the overwhelming majority of American Jews, was, for understandable reasons for his historic support for Israel, was liked by the clear majority of Israelis. Nor is the breakdown of the relationship a one-way street. Israelis, who have, as a general rule, always taken a dim view of the diaspora, now view their American cousins with equal distaste. Israelis regard American Jewish critiques of their security and peace policies as uninformed and naive. Complaints about the fact that the Israeli government doesn't officially recognize Reform and conservative Judaism are sometimes dismissed as irrelevant because both are considered to be marginal and essentially foreign movements. Israeli and American Jewry are now not only increasingly at odds with each other, but also ignorant of and indifferent to each other's concerns. This has created a justified sense of crisis in the organized Jewish world, as evidenced by the statistics that you just stated, Sarah. Israel, the issue that once unified Jewry, has become, in many ways, the most diverse topic it must deal with. Why is that so? The Jewish left takes it as an article of faith that what they consider to be Israel's illiberal politics have locked it into an intractable conflict that rendered it unattractive to North American Jewry. Many Jews agree. But the idea that the bond between the two communities didn't start to fray until Israelis began electing right-wing governments, building West Bank settlements, which allegedly made peace with the Palestinians impossible, which is actually a myth, and ignoring the demands of liberal denominations for equal treatment is a myth. Even in the heyday of the We Are One campaigns, the slogan was always more aspirational than descriptive. The assumption that American Jews were always steadfast proponents of Zionism and only became disillusioned by the ascendancy of the Likud, and especially the last decade or so during Benjamin Netanyahu's unprecedented run as prime minister, dominated Israeli politics, is untrue. When placed in the context of the history of the modern Zionist movement that stretches back to 1898, and we just are celebrating the 125th anniversary of the Basel Congress, those periods of greatest enthusiasm for Israel on the part of American Jews, specifically the reaction to the wars of 1948, 1967, and 1973, were always more of an exception than the rule. The difference between these two Jewish tribes goes far deeper than politics or even religion. At the heart of the problem is the fact that the two nations were founded for very different reasons and embrace fundamental beliefs that are in some ways poles apart. The same is true of their vision of the role of Judaism or religion itself in the life of the two countries. If American Jews have a problem with Israel, and many do, and the number of those who do is growing, it is not with what it does, but with what it is. The two nations are bound together by support for the values of democracy and are natural allies in the context of the contemporary Middle East, where all other countries are ruled by authoritarians and theocrats, and the threat from Iran looms large over all of them. But there is a profound difference between the American experiment in democracy, which is avowedly non-sectarian, and a nation state whose purpose it is to provide a home and security for one specific people that have been persecuted for 20 centuries. The United States is a nation whose existence is rooted in universal values that seek to break down the barriers between peoples and faiths. But like most other nations on the planet, Israel is an expression of particularism. Its priority is to reconstitute and defend Jewish sovereignty in the ancient homeland of the Jews, and not to be the last best hope of all mankind. The inherent tension between a state whose purpose is sectarian, but which seeks to govern itself democratically and with respect for the rights of all the religious and ethnic minorities within its borders, is a perennial theme of Israeli politics and debates. But even in its most idealized form, a particularist project like Zionism has been a difficult sell for many American Jews. Their status as the freest, wealthiest, and most powerful community in the history of the diaspora is based on a love affair with the American constitutional order, something that has only lately come under attack from woke leftism. that Jews are so at home in the United States, and despite the reality of anti-Semitism, have never, except for very rare instances early in its history, suffered official discrimination, is the living proof that American exceptionalism is no myth. But that happy state of affairs has caused the overwhelming majority of American Jews to view sectarian concerns as inherently antithetical to their well-being, as well as possibly racist, which to 21st century American liberals is the worst possible insult. Having found a home in which they were not only welcomed and granted free access to every sector of American society, but also in which the non-Jewish majority proved willing to marry them, it is unsurprising that they have difficulty coming to terms with an avowedly ethnic religious state whose raison d'etre is so different. Indeed, with non-Orthodox Judaism having embraced social justice as its primary focus, support for Jewish nationalism is bound to be at odds with their American Jewish ethos, as defined by many of its leading activist and faith organizations. And we see that in the way that the organized Jewish world fails to react and rally to Israel. Though non-Jewish Americans have always been inclined to sympathy for the notion of reconstituting a Jewish homeland because of their faith in the Bible, American Jewish resistance to Zionism was ferocious in the first half century after the founding of Zionism until the birth of Israel in 1948. Though two Reform rabbis, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who's best remembered for not such good things, and Abba Hillel Silver became the leading advocates for a Jewish state in the 1930s and 40s, the Reform movement was ideologically opposed to any thought of a promised land other than the United States. Other mainstream groups, like the American Jewish community, were similarly resistant to Zionism then. Even those Jews who did embrace Zionism, like U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, did so in a manner that contradicted the assumptions of Zionists elsewhere. While classical Zionist thought regarded the negation of the diaspora as both necessary and inevitable, even Americans who thought of Zionism as central to Jewish identity did not regard themselves as living in exile. Brandeis Zionism was one whose purpose was to support the efforts of others living in less happy lands to move to what was then Palestine and create a homeland. American Jews had no intention of going themselves. The impact of the Holocaust and then the drama of Israel's creation and early wars effectively squelched anti-Zionist sentiment as an active political force. But that seeming consensus ended once the murder of 6 million Jews, who had no homeland to flee to before there was an Israel, was safely in the distant past. After 1973, the notion of a second Holocaust, should the Jewish state suffer a catastrophic military defeat, seemed more like science fiction than a source of genuine fear, something that has only now come into question with the chance of Iran getting a nuclear weapon. But still, the eventual return of that pre-1948 debate about Zionism was probably inevitable. It doesn't necessarily follow that liberalism and nationalism are incompatible. For example, Winston Churchill's efforts to defend Western civilization were not a contradiction of his ardent British patriotism. Similarly, Zionist leaders, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of the movement that eventually morphed into the Likud that governed Israel for most of the last 40 years, envisioned a Zionist Israel state that would be both devoutly liberal in its governance while aggressively defending itself, and that with an iron wall that would eventually wear down the resistance of its Arab foes. That is a strategy that was proven prophetic both by the liberal nature of the Israeli state and the wavering interest on the part of much of the Arab and Muslim worlds in the century-old Palestinian-Arab war on Zionism after Israel's repeated military successes and has now been confirmed by the Abraham Accords. But in Israel that is confronted with the arduous and often messy problems of conducting what is a generational war against Islamists and Arab nationalists who are incapable of accepting the legitimacy of a Jewish state, no matter where its borders are drawn, is bound to horrify some American Jews whose visions of liberalism has little room for particularist nation states. Cynthia Ozick's quip that universalism is the parochialism of the Jews has never seemed more apropos than in the context of the debate among American Jews now about Israel. Another factor that has undermined support for Israel is not so much ideological as it is demographic. The benefits of American freedom and the breaking down of the walls of prejudice have been as obvious as they are historic. But this has come at an accelerated rate of assimilation and astronomical rates of intermarriage that have broken down and fundamentally changed the outlook and character of American Jewry, whose fastest growing demographic group is now labeled by demographers as Jews of no religion. The profound Jewish illiteracy of the vast majority of Jews in America, combined with their inherent hostility to sectarianism, has created a toxic environment in which groups that are highly critical, if not hostile to Israel, like J Street, have gained mainstream acceptance, and anti-Zionist and even anti-Semitic groups with Jewish in their titles, like Jewish Voices for Peace, and if not now, actually engage in anti-Semitism and gain traction and growing support on the Jewish left. And those who share such abhorrent views are now regularly given space in publications like the New York Times, which are still regarded by many Jews as akin to the Bible. Simply put, a Jewish population that has not merely accepted intermarriage and the consequent decline in the number of children who are receiving a Jewish education and ultimately starting new Jewish families, but no longer regards endogamy as an acceptable goal, is bound to take a dim view of a country that specifically defines itself as a Jewish state. No matter how generous its policies towards the Palestinians or how the non-Orthodox denominations might be treated. Just for one example, the 2018 address of popular novelist Michael Chabon to a graduation ceremony at a Reform seminary, in which he not only disdained Israel's right to defend its borders, but also condemned efforts to establish any boundaries around Jewish identity, was, I think, a seminal moment. If growing numbers of American Jews now form a community that is no longer certain that its survival matters, how can one possibly expect them to regard the understandable interest of Israeli Jews in preserving their states against still potent forces threatening genocide with anything but indifference? To note the demographic implosion of non-Orthodox Jewry is not to assert that Jewish life is, as well as any support for Israel among American Jews, is on the verge of becoming extinct. Though still a small minority, Orthodox Judaism, whose adherents tend to be more supportive of the Jewish state, is growing in the United States. Those elements of the non-Orthodox majority who are resisting the lure of assimilation and are more interested in Jewish learning and consequently deeply involved with Israel as an irreplaceable resource and the centerpiece of modern American Jewish life. But it would be foolish to pretend that pro-Israel activism, as expressed by groups like AIPAC and all through the spectrum, is not increasingly alien to the mindset of a certain kind of liberal Jew that is rather than the product of a communal consensus.
All right.
Politics.
Politics,
as where for Jews, like everyone else, is bifurcated in this country, and that we are deeply divided, with a minority who are Orthodox or politically conservative or more likely to prioritize support for Israel, while the non-Orthodox liberal majority regards it as best as merely one issue and nowhere near the top of their priority list. As the two major parties have largely exchanged identities over the last half century, with Republicans who were once mixed about Israel now lockstep supporters and Democrats now divided over it, that too has added to the problem. Much of American Jewry now regards Israel as much the same way they view red state America, as an alien place, animated by concerns they neither understand nor sympathize with. It is true, however, that both communities still need each other, and the core of American Jewry that still affiliates and regards Judaism as an important part of their lives will continue to care about Israel. But anyone who thinks the spirit of 1948, 67, and 73 can be rekindled absent the possibility of Israel morphing back into a victim nation in danger of annihilation rather than a regional military superpower with a first world economy, something that the Iranian regime that it may be well be enriched and empowered by the current administration would like to bring about, is kidding themselves. Still, both American Jews and Israelis need to make a fundamental decision not to let the relationship founder and to make an effort to see each other in the best light while accepting that there are differences rather than raging against them. We also need to discard expectations that either Americans or Israelis will somehow magically transform themselves into mirror images of each other, rather than being the products of radically different experiences and beliefs. This is a sober truth that cannot be ignored, especially for those of us who understand that however aspirational they may be, efforts to promote a common sense of Jewish peoplehood are essential to the Jewish future in both America and Israel. The lessons of Jewish history teach us that such divisions can have devastating consequences for a people whose numbers are still small and whose existence, for all of Israel's vaunted military and economic strength and American Jewry's influence and affluence, is still essentially fragile. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
I remember, Jonathan, about 20 years ago, reading a brilliant article by Natan Sharansky in Commentary magazine, where he called the universities in this great democratic experiment in the United States pockets of anti-Semitism. We've all heard horror stories on an almost daily basis of Jewish students being singled out, harassed and demonized, and sometimes even physically threatened or assaulted for their support of Israel. Such as on August 26th of this year, when a group of Berkeley law students associated with the BDS program have written a declaration barring the free speech of any student or invited person who is associated with Zionism. Or the recent case of a SUNY New Paltz student who had been raped and formed a sexual assault awareness club. And when they found out she was a Zionist, she was expelled from the very group she had formed. Or in CUNY this July, a group of college professors entitled Not in Our Name encouraged their peers to support BDS and to stand against all methods of normalization with Zionist entities. I want to direct everyone to the wonderful work of the Amcha Initiative, who assiduously documents almost on a daily basis a log of anti-Semitic incidents that she is aware of on U.S. college campuses, and of the amazing work of both Ken Marcus and Aliza Lewin of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, who have been trying tirelessly to advocate with the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights for certain fundamental justices for American Jewish students on college campuses. I remember also Natan Sharansky talking about the old classical anti-Semitism against the Jewish people and the Jewish religion, and the new anti-Semitism against the state of Israel, the collective of the Jewish people. Do you think, Jonathan, that the lines between the old anti-Semitism and the new anti-Semitism have become eroded?
Well, first, I would echo your praise for Amcha and for the great work of the Brandeis Center. They're very important. But you're right to focus us on what's going on college campuses, because for most Jews, the Jews who are most likely to encounter anti-Semitism in America fall into two groups. They're either ultra-Orthodox Jews in inner cities who have been targeted by minorities, such as the epidemic of violence in the greater New York area, or more likely, and more popularly, if you will, on college campuses, because it's the anti-Semitic BDS movement and left-wing anti-Semitism, which is rooted in popular and toxic intellectual myths like critical race theory and intersectionalism, have become normative in American society. It's the troubling thing is not just that these are isolated incidents. They're not isolated, as you pointed out. There are examples all over, and it's even greater than just cherry picking, a few really outrageous incidents. It is an atmosphere in American intellectual life in which, as I was alluding to in my remarks earlier, in which the particularism of Zionism is regarded as somehow as racism. Because all Jews and the state of Israel are regarded as possessors of white privilege, which is in critical race theory, the worst thing you can say. And of course, it makes no sense because the majority of Israeli Jews are people of color by the definitions of the American left, because they trace their origins to North Africa or to the Middle East. But the point here is that kind of anti-Semitism is the real threat. It's the threat that has establishment support, as I say. Articles like that you read in the New York Times all the time. There are members of Congress that stand up and speak for these issues, such as Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Part of our political discourse is being mainstreamed, this kind of anti-Semitism. There is old anti-Semitism of extremism on the right, which certainly shouldn't be ignored, and we need to guard against. But the kind of anti-Semitism that Jews are more likely to encounter is this delegitimization of Jewish identity and of Zionism that targets not so much Israel, because it's, the BDS movement hasn't done that much damage to Israel's economy or any at all, but it targets American Jews for expressing their Jewish identity. And that's the conundrum, because at the center of this are Jewish groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace that are also mainstreaming anti-Semitism. And this is where we have to aim our targets, and against those who refuse to fight against them on the left and who even legitimize them and say that there's nothing wrong with such beliefs. And that's the true dilemma for an American Jewry that doesn't want to be out of sync with liberal fashion, as we've seen with many of the mainstream organizations refusing or being slow to condemn left-wing anti-Semitism. But that is where the real threat lies for most American Jews.
Right. Last week, I had a great conversation with a dear close friend of mine who's a Zionist, a very well-educated Jew, and her main issue is global warming. I had another one this week with another friend who told me that her only issue is a woman's right to choose. These people have great Jewish educations and backgrounds and feel comfortable in both worlds. I told both of them that there are millions of good people working on these issues, but very few of us have the education and the background and feel comfortable in the corridors of power to be able to articulate what Israel is actually up against and what the Jewish people are up against today, and that we have a moral imperative to do this. How would you suggest approaching our fellow Jews who seem to have given up on advocating for Jewish peoplehood?
Well, that is the key issue. I mean, part of it, as I said before, is about demography and about the changing nature of American Jewry. The truth is, most Jews in this country live lives that are no different from their non-Jewish neighbors. And so it's hardly surprising that their concerns are no different from their non-Jewish neighbors. Even though I might add, non-Jews in this country are deeply supportive of Israel. We are far from alone. Unfortunately, for many Jews, the fact that conservative Christians are sort of the base of American support for Israel in this country is actually an argument against supporting Israel because they disagree with them about other issues. The point here is that, yes, of course, for many American Jews, including those who, if you ask them, say they care about Israel, they do prioritize the issue of abortion. They do prioritize whatever fashionable liberal issue that they think is the most important thing, whether it's global warming or name something else. But the Jewish idea, but if we're concerned about the survival of the Jewish state, if we're concerned about the survival of the Jewish people, we have to focus on threats to the specifically to the Jewish people that activism on other issues cannot answer. And indeed, in some ways, creates obstacles to activism on behalf of Israel, because it can mean that they don't want to make alliances with people with whom they disagree with on other issues. So I think our argument there is not to tell people not to care about whatever it is that they care about, but to remind them, as you say, that not only, that only we can speak up on this issue with the kind of authority that we must lend to it, but that if your priority isn't about the survival of the Jewish people, you have to answer. I mean, we answer. I often speak about the American Jewish history. We remember those Jews who failed to speak out during the Holocaust, and we remember them as with great disdain. And we speak up of the heroes of the Soviet Jewry movement as something that we should be proud of. But we too are living in a time that will be remembered by history. And we will be judged not by our brothers and sisters in Israel, not by our non-Jewish friends, but we will be judged by history as to whether we were there and willing to speak up and make our voices heard on issues that truly are existential, truly are about the survival of the Jewish people. If we fail to do that, then we are discarding Jewish identity in ways that I think even some of the most assimilated Jews would be reluctant to admit.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And now it's my profound honor and pleasure to turn the podium over to Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who every single day of his life works so hard on behalf of our people, the Jewish people. Hussein?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Jonathan, for such an informative and profoundly insightful presentation. And thank you very much, all our viewers have been listening to us, and those who sent us questions. Please keep sending us your questions through the Q&A function from Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Jonathan, one of the first questions that we received, do you see a correlation between a lack of Jewish identity or nominal identification with Judaism or Jewish culture and the loss of support to Israel and Zionism?
Well, I think they're related. If you don't care about, as I said before, if you don't care about the survival of Jews here, why would we expect those people to care about the survival of a Jewish community elsewhere? The truth is, much of American Jewry is sort of assimilating itself out of existence. As I said, the demographers say the group that is the fastest growing in American Jewry are Jews of no religion, and it's not just that they eschew religion; their identity, all the surveys show that the things they care about in terms of what defines you as a Jew, they'll say things like social justice, which is certainly something that Jews have always and should care about. But Israel and normative things, whether it's Jewish law, are way down on the list. A community that is solely focused on issues like social justice and only tangentially interested in Israel, which many of them view, as I say, as a red state or somehow an alien thing. It's foolish to think that is a community where a lot of pro-Israel activism is going to foster. The counter to it is that we have to engage people with Israel. We have to get kids to Israel. We have to educate people about this and sort of make an impact on that demographic fact. But it would be, I think it would be silly to think that we can totally reverse it. Because for many people with Jewish origins, that's all they are. They're people with Jewish origins. They don't really care about any sense of Jewish peoplehood or feel any sense of responsibility to Jews elsewhere, or even to other Jews in their own community.
Thank you. I'll actually take a prerogative question here. So yes, I think you spoke about the people who do have the kind of this Jewish illiteracy and very almost superficial tie with Judaism that needs to be enforced. But for me, and I'm not Jewish, I have strong ties with the Jewish community, but I can see that there is also another group, one that actually wants to claim a strong tie to Judaism, but kind of a new Judaism, in which something like tikkun olam means recycling. Now, I'm not Jewish, but I'm pretty certain that tikkun olam did not mean recycling. But obviously,
you're right about that.
But obviously, that's what they're doing. It's not that they want to detach themselves from Judaism. They want to grab Judaism their way, in which there is a new ideological content is poured into Judaism in terms of social justice and so on. I think those might be a harder case to deal with than people who don't have ties with Judaism. How this group should be approached, in your opinion?
Well, you're absolutely right. Social justice Judaism is what a lot of American Jews, believe is Judaism. The problem with social justice Judaism is that if you want to be green, if you want to care about global warming or environmentalism, it's a lot easier to do it without all the Jewish trappings. If you want to be, someone who's advocating for abortion or, pick any fashionable liberal cause, it's a lot easier to do it without trying to justify it through some ties to Judaism. So I think those are not really transmissible values, as the demographers would say. How we approach such people, I think we have to just try to remind them that caring about Israel, that Judaism is central. If you want some kind of Jewish identity, Israel, the Jewish people, is central to it. You can't, you can redefine yourself. You can call yourself, in this day and age, you can call yourself anything and demand respect, demand that everybody agree with you, which is a whole nother issue, which maybe we won't get into. But the point is, if you want to be a Jew, you have to at some point come to terms with the fact that that means a whole set of beliefs and is part of a people with a home. Now, yes, there are many American Jews that are seeking to redefine it. And honestly, I don't think we're going to have a lot of success convincing them that their Tikkun Olam Judaism, as you put it, or social justice Judaism, ought to include Israel, because that involves them being involved with something that is very sectarian, that is parochial, when their concerns are almost solely universal. What we can offer American Jews who are unrooted or disconnected from traditional Jewish life is the fact that Judaism does offer meaning. Israel and Jewish peoplehood offers them something of real value that is not ephemeral, that is not offered elsewhere. It is in an age where authenticity is something we all seek, and meaning is something that everybody lacks in their lives, where we're all glued to screens and on social media. The mindset that we are offering them is much more authentic and has much more meaning than that which they're currently involved. But if all you care about is sort of finding a Jewish gloss on sort of fashionable leftist ideas, I don't think we're going to reach them.
Could I just add there, it's very, very disturbing to me that we have a definition of anti-Semitism that exists. The IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, that does define as one of the core anti-Semitic things as the denial of a Jewish homeland and Jewish sovereignty, denying the exact words, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Recently, ironically, there are people that penned the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which is a total different definition, which does not include denial of Jewish national sovereignty, and says that criticizing or opposing Zionism is not anti-Semitic, and that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions are commonplace, non-violent forms of political protest against states. In the Israel case, they are not in and of themselves anti-Semitic. So this is a direct result, I think, of the phenomena that you're describing, Jonathan, where they want to disassociate themselves with the Jewish homeland, and I think are so self-conscious of their Jewishness and any attachment to the state of Israel that they are talking about criticism of Israel and the BDS program as being fine. That's not anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think it's a deeply insidious and dangerous trend. You're right. These are people who are disaffected in many ways from normative Jewish beliefs, but they are eager. If nobody wants to be called anti-Semitic, they don't want to be. They consider themselves liberal and praiseworthy and supporters of human rights. Now, of course, so what they need to do in order to keep that and still hate Israel and still deny to the Jews rights that you would not think of denying to anybody else, you have to redefine anti-Semitism as including saying that it's okay to discriminate against Jews. It's okay to discriminate against the Jewish state. It's okay to deny Jews rights that you wouldn't deny to anyone else, to treat Israel differently than you would treat any other country on the planet, to say that one Jewish state on this entire planet is one too many. That is inherently anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. But if your goal is to sort of not merely to sort of have a deracinated sort of American Judaism where you think about everything else but Jewish concerns, but to specifically support those looking to destroy Israel, and that is what the people who are doing this are doing, then you have to try, then your goal is to redefine anti-Semitism as to say that it's okay to be anti-Semitic. And that's what a lot of the articles that we see in the New York Times, such as recent things by Peter Beinart, who claims to be an observant Jew and used to be a liberal Zionist, that's the goal here. It's not just that they're sort of defecting from Judaism and the Israel, and the Jewish cause and Zionism. They want to say that it's okay to be anti-Semitic. And in doing, and the only way to do that is to redefine anti-Semitism as to not include anti-Semitism, which is nonsensical, it's illogical, but it's deeply toxic. And the fact that it gets a hearing in places like the New York Times, which are still considered by many Jews to be authoritative, is really one of the more dangerous and things going on in our society today.
Thank you. We've received a counterpoint question that I think is very fair to ask. We spoke about, far left and progressive Judaism. Well, we have a question asking, there are also right-wing Jews who feel, care more about Trump and taxes. Exactly, you could say, like left-wing Jews care about the abortion and the environment. Is this group any more reliable than the progressives?
Well, I think you can, of course. I mean, Jews who are Democrats care about the Democrats. Jews who are Republicans care about the Republicans. But where we are entitled, and that's just normal, and that's fine. Where that becomes problematic is not just the fact that they prioritize their partisan politics, and in truth, politics has now replaced the role that religion used to play for most Americans in their lives. But where we can judge whether this is something that's dangerous or not dangerous is whether it causes them to alter their positions about issues that affect the security of Israel and the Jewish people. If your partisanship causes you to ally yourself with anti-Semites, with people who are opposed to the existence of Israel, who are promoting the anti-Semitic BDS movement, but you're saying, well, I like them on other issues and they're fellow Democrats, well, I think we have a right to criticize that. If Republicans were to do that, you'd say that's wrong too. The problem, I think the problem is that many people in this country, many American Jews, hate Donald Trump. They hate the Republicans for all sorts of reasons, which are, can be debated. That's sort of a separate issue. But when that means that they will not support Republicans when they are pro-Israel, I mean, Trump, whether, love him, hate him, whatever you may think of him, he moved the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He recognized Jerusalem. He tried to hold the Palestinians accountable for their support for terrorism rather than enabling it. He canceled the dangerous Iran deal and tried to pressure Iran to renegotiate it so that they would not get a nuclear weapon, rather than pushing for a deal that will ensure, that will guarantee that they will get a nuclear weapon. If you're saying that your partisanship means I still have to oppose policies that are pro-Israel, then I have to say that's the problem, not whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever party you're involved with, but whether you're supporting policies and politicians that are, in fact, that are doing things that are antithetical or supportive of the Jewish state. And if partisanship is your priority, rather than support for Jewish survival, that's worthy of criticism in my line, no matter where you're going. But I think right now, we're mostly talking about people on the left who've said that their left-wing alliances and their antipathy for Republicans and Trump is more important than support for Israel.
Thank you. We received a question, and I was almost certain that we're going to receive a question like this, which is basically asking about how much of this current situation can be blamed on major American Jewish organizations. The lack of educational efforts to educate whether the Jewish community or the population about what Israel is up against, the anti-Semitism in the Middle East, the true nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict. How much of where we got to can be blamed on the failure of the major Jewish organizations?
Well, I would say certainly we can blame much of the organized Jewish world, some of the mainstream, the biggest ones, and I don't know, am I allowed to name them in this context? Whether it's the Anti-Defamation League, which has largely, I think to some extent, has given up its main brief of just being the defender of the Jews and of Israel and against anti-Semitism, and in some ways it's sort of just another liberal advocacy organization. But it's also kind of a chicken and egg thing. As much as I deplore major Jewish organizations that I think are prioritizing their, as we just alluded to, liberal politics rather than things that are important to Jewish identity and important to Jewish security, that's a reflection of their donor base. That's a reflection of their members. They are that way not because just a few people, have conspired to take them over and to turn them away from their true mission, but because that is what most of the people who get involved with these groups want. It reflects it reflects sort of American Jewish society and where we have come as a community, and how distant we are from the ideas that would prioritize Jewish concerns rather than more secular ones. I don't want to, as much as I don't want to give them a pass for their failures and for their really terrible mistakes in which they have gone down the road of okaying and being okay with, sort of toxic ideas about critical race theory and intersectionality, just because they don't want to be accused of being racist or being out of touch with liberal fashion. But they are that way because the people who are involved there, the people who are giving them money, the people who they think are their constituency want that. And that's the real problem, not just a few leaders and not just a few, members of the alphabet soup world of American Jewish organizations.
Right. I also have to say, I have a particular complaint against many rabbis that use their 501c3 platform in their synagogues to basically preach, an agenda of everything against Israel, and certain camps that offer J Street to come in and educate their campers, certain schools. I find it really, there is a border. There really is a border, and I think everybody should feel comfortable walking into a synagogue, no matter what their political affiliation is. And when they take up an extreme liberal banner and bash Israel, I think they've crossed over the line. I think people should feel, comfortable, just as any student should feel comfortable on a college campus without being assaulted for being a Jew. Any Jew who might prioritize Israel's continuous survival should feel comfortable walking into any synagogue in this country.
I think this points to a really important issue, sort of in the organized Jewish world, and I think you're getting to the heart of it. American Jewry, we believe in a big tent. We want to include everyone. We don't want to exclude. Diversity is a very big thing. It's a very fashionable idea, and in part, I can't say I'm against it. As a journalist, I've been told my whole career, I've spent my whole career being told to shut up by people who disagree with me. I'm not in the business of telling people to shut up. That said, if the only thing that we care about is inclusion, if diversity is the primary value, then we don't really stand for anything. And a community that doesn't stand for anything, and especially standing for Jewish survival, standing for support for Israel, is not one that has much chance of continuing. It's not worth even really. It's not even worth continuing. So I think organizations that open their gates to really not groups that are not merely critical of Israel, but that are critical of Zionism and that oppose the Jewish state's existence. And after all, that's the real argument. We're not arguing so much over where Israel's borders should be, specific policies. That's a snare. I mean, it's not about, yes, of course, criticism of Israel isn't anti-Semitic. I mean, 7 million Jews get up every day in Israel and criticize their government, just as 330 million Americans get up every day and criticize their government. The issue at stake is whether there should be an Israel, whether there should be one Jewish state on this planet. And if you're opening your doors to groups and people that call that into question, that are allied with a movement whose purpose is to destroy Israel, something that could only be accomplished, I might add, by that genocide of those 7 million Jews, then I don't think you have a place in American Jewish forums. It shouldn't happen on our dime that those views get a hearing. And if in the name of diversity, we're enabling those people who are not merely undermining Jewish unity, but undermining support for the right of Israel to continue to exist, that's a huge mistake. And to do so in the name of sort of liberal values is the most illiberal thing I can think of.
Thank you. I want to apologize to all our viewers who sent us questions. We're running out of time, so we're not going to be able to get to a lot of the questions. We actually received many questions, and that of course because of the existential nature of the topic. So I'm going to go ahead and combine some questions together, and that will be the last question that we'll ask. And we received a number of questions about youth, about Jewish youth. Today, we talked about the campuses. You rightfully pointed out how they are kind of the origin and the source of a lot of what's going on, and that's the natural habitat of a lot of the youth. Now, they go to these places, they have all of that pressure on them to conform to this new anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist ideological current. At the same time, you have this progressive Judaism open to them kind of as their own exit. How can the Jewish community protect its youth from this process of indoctrination? And do you see any counter currents amongst the youth that are promising?
Well, we can't protect, if you're going to swim in the non-Jewish sea, that is America, where we're a small, if we're talking about American Jews, we're less than 2% of the population. Unless you're going to just stay within the community, you're going to have to be out there. And the way we can, we can't completely defend our kids from these sort of views, but we can arm them with the facts. We can arm them with examples of what is right. We can tell them the truth. We can get them to Israel. We can make them Jewishly literate in the history and the facts about Israel, so as to be able to speak back. But the truth is, the main problem, the main element that young Jews need is not so much, a copy of the old, what AIPAC used to give out, the myths and facts about the Middle East. It's something else, and that's courage. We need to model and inculcate them the values that it is okay to stand up. It is okay to be unpopular. It is okay to stand against the tide of mainstream liberal opinion, which dominates college campuses and dominates much of American popular culture. Asking people to do that is hard. You know, it's not easy to be the object of attacks from, as I say, from fashionable ideology. But that is something that we are simply obliged to do. Being a Jew has always meant, from the time of the Maccabees to our own, being willing to stand up against the idols of popular culture of any day. And the idols of popular culture in our day are these, toxic myths about critical race theory and intersectionality that makes it hard for young Jews to speak up for Israel. Now, it's difficult to model that courage. It's difficult for adults to speak truth to power, whether it's politicians. It's even harder for kids to talk back to student groups or even to professors who are bullying them. But if we're going to live in the world, that is what we must do, and we must model it. And so it is courage that we must give them. We must tell them that it's okay to stand up and speak out in that manner. And am I encouraged? I'm encouraged every time I go to campuses and I meet young Jews who are willing to do that. They're never going to be the majority, because the majority are always going to try to fit in. But we need role models that will show that it is possible to speak up and survive. People who will go on these campuses where these terrible things are happening and push back. They need our support. They need our vocal support. They need our financial support. They need our organizations to speak about their plight, to highlight this, because this is where, as I said before, this is where practical anti-Semitism is really most often practiced, which is affecting American Jewry. That is what we must do. And we must always remember, we will be judged by whether we had the courage to speak up when others were silent.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Tobin. It is a pleasure. It is always an absolute pleasure to read you and to hear you. You're spot on in what you write. I want to encourage everybody once again to support jns.org. And every single day, Hussein and I do tell the truth to power. And it's not always easy, but we struggle to find the right diplomatic words to be able to penetrate, and even the most democratic offices. So I would really like to encourage people to support also the work of Emet, because what we're doing is very lonely. And not everybody is on Capitol Hill every day trying to penetrate through the biases, and we make progress. I don't mind saying to you that actually a staffer from Elizabeth Warren's office in Massachusetts, one of the most liberal, said he really wanted to hear from us again. He thanked us for his perspective, and he said it's a perspective we rarely hear. And keeping on top of the facts is really, really important. But so please, if you can, support both the wonderful work of jns.org and emetonline.org. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to everyone. And I echo your pleas to support Emet, and please log on to jns.org every day. We have fresh material, fresh news and perspectives that will help arm you to deal with these issues on a daily basis.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much.